previous video I already mentioned some of the leading authors in the field of terrorism and counterterrorism studies. And in this video we're going to look at some other examples of key authors, very important centers and key journals in my area of expertise. Well, here's a list of some of the most well-known, most relevant, most often quoted authors in the field of terrorism and counterterrorism studies. Have a look at the list. What do you notice? Look at the first names. You see very few ladies among them. Anne Speckhard, Jessica Stern, Martha Crenshaw, we have already mentioned her, and my colleague Beatrice de Graaf. We'll come back to that later. An interesting list of interesting people, and if you want to know more about them, I've added a list of these people with their main publications on the course dashboard. The key research centers include think tanks, NGOs, and of course many academic institutes that focus on terrorism, counterterrorism, radicalization, etc. Well, here are just a few places where I think the most prestigious centers are based. That's in Washington, D.C. and surrounding area. Think of the University of Maryland just outside the Beltway, and downtown Washington, Rand Corporation, well, it's in Arlington. Georgetown University, also not really downtown Washington, but Washington-based centers are among the key centers in the field of terrorism studies. Same holds for London, where you find quite a number of universities and think tanks that focus on terrorism and counterterrorism. And one that has done so for quite a while is based in St Andrews, all the way up in Scotland, where I think if I had to maybe pick one institute, it's maybe St Andrews that is among the most prestigious ones. While outside Europe, outside America, you have an institute in Israel, Herzliya, and one in Singapore, which I would count among the leading ones in the field of terrorism and counterterrorism studies. Earlier I mentioned the enormous increase in terrorism studies and the establishment of many new centers after the attacks on 9/11. Well, the Center of Terrorism and Counterterrorism of Leiden University is one of them, and together with the neighbors, the International Center for Counterterrorism, I believe that The Hague is one of the new institutes that also play a role in my field of study. And the same holds for a number of institutes in Scandinavia, Oslo, Stockholm. Of course, in Spain there's quite a lot of expertise, centers in Madrid. And also a more recent phenomenon is the Center of Excellence of NATO on Terrorism in Ankara. And in Australia you have important centers of knowledge in Melbourne. And I would also like to mention one center in the United States that has produced very interesting results and much training to people working in the field of terrorism, and that's the Oklahoma Center for Terrorism Studies, which was established after the attack by Timothy McVeigh in 1995, who blew up a building there, killing 150 people. And one of the initiatives that came out of that attack was a center of excellence where people realized they needed to know more about terrorism. Where do you find the main academic output of these research centers and individual scholars? Well, of course, increasingly on the internet, weblogs, etc. But good old journals are still very important today, especially in the academic world. Well, here are the 5 leading ones in the field of terrorism and counterterrorism studies. From left to right and from oldest to newest publication, you find Studies in Conflict and Terrorism. Then next to it you find Intelligence and National Security, and in the middle in blue, Terrorism and Political Violence. And then the 2 other ones. You could say they're the most rebellious and the newest kid on the block. So Critical Studies on Terrorism offers a forum for a lot of writers, authors that have a different view on the study of terrorism, and maybe in particular on the way terrorism is dealt with by states. So it's a more critical journal, as the title already suggests. And then you find the latest one, Perspectives on Terrorism, which is an open online journal of which I'm very much a favor, offering a platform for both many authors who can write and publish, but also a lot of readers who can freely access all the studies, interesting studies that are published in that journal. On the course dashboard you find a link to these journals as well as to the centers that I've mentioned earlier. When I presented the list of authors in the field of terrorism and counterterrorism studies, I asked you if you noticed anything particular about that list. Well, let's now project that list on a map as well as that of the centers and the journals. What do you see? Do you see something remarkable? What about this statement? The study of terrorism and counterterrorism is not only a male-dominated discipline, but also a heavily Western-dominated discipline. My next question would be, is this a problem? And if so, why is this a problem? I would love to hear your opinion about this by way of this next questionnaire. Thank you for filling out the questionnaire. I'm very curious about the results, which we're going to discuss online. How would I have answered that question? Well, I do think that the study of terrorism and counterterrorism is a male-dominated, Western-dominated discipline. I mean, look at the facts, look at the map. There's no way in denying it. Do I think it's a problem? Well, to some extent. About male dominance, I would like to give my dear friend and colleague, Professor Beatrice de Graaf, the opportunity to say something. And she is the author of a very interesting book, published in Dutch, called Dangerous Militant Women. And she definitely has an interesting opinion on this.
Hi there, my name is Beatrice de Graaf. I'm a researcher at the Center for Terrorism and Counterterrorism here in The Hague. I'm an historian by training, so let's reflect a little bit on what Edwin Bakker said about male dominance in terrorism research. Is that true? Well, historically, most of the academic scientific disciplines in the world do have a male dominance, unfortunately enough. However, it might just be the case that in the terrorism research business, women are slightly on the march. There is some overrepresentation compared to other disciplines of female engaging in terrorism research. Take, for example, Martha Crenshaw. She's one of the most famous terrorism researchers there is nowadays. She could be considered the godmother of terrorism research from an historical perspective. She wrote the book Terrorism in Context, which is still a seminal work for students to learn more about the histories, the origins of terrorism. And there are a number of other female researchers who interviewed, who worked with female terrorists themselves and who wrote great, terrific books on female terrorism. For example, Mia Bloom, she wrote a book on the reasons why women engage in terrorism called Bombshell. And there is another book by Jessica Stern on suicide terrorism. But there is also an important study of Anne Speckhard of women engaged in, for example, Chechnya, the Chechen war on terrorism. So, just to round this point up, there is indeed male dominance in the terrorism research, but women are on the march.
What about Western dominance? I do think that is a problem. There are too few non-Western scholars from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and it has resulted in much attention to terrorism in the West or against the West, and far less attention to terrorism elsewhere. And if we look at the map of terrorist incidents worldwide, we know that most terrorism takes place outside the Western world. And what about the study of counterterrorism? If we look, for instance, at Pakistan, there's much attention to counterterrorism in Pakistan and how that can help us to increase safety and security in the western part of the world. But what about the impact it has on Pakistan? What about what terrorism does to Pakistan itself? There's far much less attention to that. And think about this statement about labeling terrorists. Here you see a picture of a man who killed a number of people in a cinema near Denver. And the statement says, I shot 71 people and killed 12 of them and it reads, "If I were a Muslim, they would have called me a terrorist." What do the makers of this statement want to show? What do they want to hint at? And do you agree with that? I'm not sure, but I do think that Western media, society and scholars might be a bit biased when it comes to labeling terrorism, especially when Muslims are involved. Summarizing this video, we've seen that most authors in the field of terrorism and counterterrorism studies are either based in North America or in Europe. Well, this Western bias has some negative implications for research, and it's good to be aware of that. Hopefully this will change in the years to come. In the next video, we're going to discuss some of the practical challenges and dilemmas when doing research on terrorism and counterterrorism.